Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. In the heart of rural America, farmer Dan Miller always considered his land untouchable. But when his neighbor, successful businessman Richard Johnson, started offering outrageous sums for the farm, Dan had no idea it was more than just a deal. It was a dangerous game of survival. Daniel Dan Miller had always been proud of his farm. At 55, he was the third generation to work the land that had been passed down through his family for over 80 years. His property stretched over 150 acres of fertile land with sprawling fields, an old farmhouse that was as weathered as the trees surrounding it, a pond filled with fish, and several barns filled with farming equipment. It wasn't just a farm to him. It was home. The place where his father and grandfather had worked, raised families, and lived their lives. Dan had never once thought about selling it. The idea seemed almost absurd to him. The land was more than just soil and crops. It was where his roots ran deep. As he sat on the porch in the evenings, sipping his coffee and watching the sun set over the fields, he felt a deep connection to the land. There were times when he'd let his mind wander, but it was always to the future of the farm, how his children, and maybe even his grandchildren, would inherit the same peace he'd found there. But that all started to change when Richard Johnson moved in next door. Johnson was a 45-year-old real estate developer, recently retired from his high-powered business career in the city. He had purchased the house next door, a sprawling mansion that sat just on the edge of Dan's property, a perfect location for his dreams of creating a luxury housing development. Dan didn't know much about Johnson except that he was eager to impress everyone he met, often mentioning his success in business and how he had worked hard to get here. It didn't take long for Johnson to approach Dan with a proposition. One afternoon, he knocked on Dan's door, wearing a tailored suit and an overly confident smile. He introduced himself, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, he made his offer. Johnson wanted to buy Dan's farm, at first for a generous price. Dan listened politely but didn't take the offer seriously. His family had worked the land for generations, and he wasn't about to sell out now, especially to someone he barely knew. However, Johnson didn't take the rejection well. He wasn't used to hearing no from people. Over the next few weeks, he made several more attempts, each offer growing higher than the last. Each time Dan declined, Johnson's demeanor shifted. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. Dan couldn't shake the feeling that Johnson saw the land as a mere obstacle to his plans for expansion. But Dan stood firm, not once considering selling. As the days turned into weeks, Dan began to notice things that made him uncomfortable, even if they were small at first. It started with the occasional vehicle driving slowly along the edge of his property, lingering for just a moment too long before pulling away. At first, he dismissed it. Maybe it was someone lost or just a curious passerby. But as the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent. One morning, Dan was walking through his fields checking the crop progress when he saw a large SUV parked at the end of his property, near the tree line. The window was rolled down, and a man inside was peering through binoculars, staring at Dan's barn. Dan froze, his heart skipping a beat. The man didn't seem to notice him at first, absorbed in whatever he was looking at. After a few moments, he quickly rolled the window back up, started the engine, and sped off down the road. Dan wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe it was just some local who was interested in his farm, but something about it felt off. The incident stuck with him, and he decided to keep an eye out for any more unusual behavior. A few days later, it happened again. This time, a couple of teenagers were walking along the edge of his property, close to the boundary where his fence met the trees. They weren't just walking. They were clearly investigating, peering over the low fence that separated his field from the woods. The next morning, Dan found that a section of the fence had been knocked down. It wasn't much, just a few broken posts and some bent wire, but it was enough to set off alarms in his head. Dan spent the afternoon repairing the fence, muttering to himself about how careless people could be. He considered calling the sheriff, but something stopped him. Maybe it wasn't worth making a fuss over something so small. After all, it could have been a deer or a fallen tree that had caused the damage. But deep down, he knew that things weren't as innocent as they seemed. Then came the day he noticed something even stranger. As he walked past his barn to check on the animals, he saw that the large wooden doors had been tampered with. They weren't fully closed. The padlock was still there, but someone had clearly tried to pry it open. Dan's blood ran cold. This was no accident. Someone was deliberately trying to gain access to his property. He began to feel the weight of an unsettling pressure building. It wasn't just a few curious individuals anymore. It felt like someone was watching him, observing him from the shadows. It was the beginning of a strange game, and he wasn't sure who was playing or what the stakes were. The tension in the air felt thick, and he knew that his life on the farm, once a quiet existence, was beginning to shift in ways he didn't fully understand. The worst part was that it wasn't just about the strange occurrences. It was the feeling that someone was deliberately trying to force him out of his comfort zone, trying to make him uncomfortable in his own home. He had to admit it. This wasn't just some coincidence. Whoever was behind these little disturbances wasn't going to stop. And, just maybe, this was the beginning of something far bigger than he could handle on his own. Over the next few days, things escalated further. Dan was woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of his dogs barking furiously. When he went outside to investigate, he saw a figure moving quickly along the edge of his property. By the time he reached the spot, the person was gone, but the dogs were still agitated. He found tracks leading into the woods, but they didn't belong to any animal. They were the unmistakable prints of heavy boots. Now Dan could no longer pretend that everything was just a coincidence. There was someone or something deliberately trying to invade his privacy. The question was, why? And who was behind it? As if to answer that question, Dan received an unexpected visitor later that week. A worker from a local construction company showed up on his doorstep, claiming that there had been an inquiry about his land. The man didn't say who had asked for the information, but he seemed to know an awful lot about Dan's property. He even mentioned that the land could be put to better use if it were sold. It was all the confirmation Dan needed. This was no longer a simple case of neighborhood curiosity. This was pressure, and it was coming from someone who had an interest in seeing him sell. Dan's suspicions grew. He was no longer just dealing with a neighbor who was looking for a piece of land. He was now facing something much more sinister. Someone was trying to force him out. The question was, how far would they go? The first police visit came just a week after Dan repaired the fence, and it set the stage for what would become an ongoing nightmare. One morning, as he was finishing up his chores and getting ready for a quiet day on the farm, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up to his front gate. Dan's heart sank as he recognized Officer Davis, a local sheriff who had been to his farm before, but never for anything serious. He had a friendly rapport with the officer, having known him for years, but the officer's serious expression made Dan uneasy. "Morning, Dan," Officer Davis greeted him. "We've received a complaint, and I need to take a look around." "Complaint? What about?" Dan asked, trying to remain calm. "Well, a local resident claims you've been illegally storing hazardous materials in your barn," Officer Davis explained, looking at him with a raised eyebrow. "Says it's a public safety issue." Dan felt a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Hazardous materials? That's ridiculous. I've been running this farm for decades, and I've never done anything of the sort." The officer nodded, but still seemed to take the complaint seriously. "We have to follow up on these things. Mind if I take a look?" Dan led him into the barn, showing him everything he used for farming: feed, equipment, tools, and plenty of dry hay. "I've got nothing here that would be considered hazardous," Dan said, pointing out the regular farming materials. "This is a working farm, not some chemical storage facility." Officer Davis looked around, nodded, and scribbled a few notes in his notepad. After a quick inspection, he turned back to Dan. "I don't see anything out of the ordinary here. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but you know how these things go. Someone calls in a concern, and we have to investigate. I'll close the case, but just be aware that people are watching." Dan watched him leave, still feeling uneasy, and then the weight of the situation hit him. Who would make such a bizarre claim about his farm? He couldn't think of anyone but Richard Johnson. It was too specific, too pointed. It was clear that Johnson wasn't letting go of his plans to take over the land. The next incident came a few days later, and it wasn't any less bizarre. Again, Dan was at home, tending to the fields when another sheriff's car pulled up. This time, Officer Larson, a newer officer in town, got out and approached him with a clipboard. "Dan Miller?" Officer Larson asked, confirming his identity. "We've had a report of illegal dumping. Someone claims you've been dumping trash in the creek on your property." Dan couldn't hide his exasperation. "Trash in the creek? That creek is full of fish. I've been taking care of that land for decades. I would never dump trash in it." "I understand, sir," the officer replied, "but the report came in from someone in the neighborhood. We have to look into it." Dan took the officer to the creek. As they approached the water, Dan noticed the same telltale signs, scraps of paper and plastic near the water's edge, but nothing that could be directly tied to him. The officer bent down and picked up a few of the pieces. "This doesn't look like farm waste," he muttered, scanning the area. Dan sighed in relief. "I don't know where that came from, but it sure wasn't me." Officer Larson stood up and nodded. "I'll make a note of this. The report was false, but we have to be thorough." Dan watched him leave, his suspicion only growing stronger. The pieces were falling into place. It was no longer just about the land. This was a campaign to harass and discredit him, to make him seem irresponsible or reckless. The only person with the means and motive to do this was Richard Johnson, but Dan couldn't afford to just sit back and wait for things to escalate. The third false report came a week after the creek incident. This time, Dan didn't need to wonder who was behind it. As he was finishing breakfast, he got a call from the sheriff's office. "Dan, we need you to come down to the station. We've received a report that you're running an illegal gambling operation on your property. We're required to investigate." Dan's blood boiled as he listened to the officer's calm voice on the phone. A gambling operation? The accusation was so absurd that Dan almost laughed, but he knew he couldn't let this go. He went down to the sheriff's office, where the officers handed him the report. Again, a vague and unverifiable accusation, but this time claiming that large amounts of money were changing hands in his barn. "I don't know who's making these accusations," Dan said firmly, "but I assure you, there's no gambling going on anywhere near my farm. I work for a living, not for shady deals." Officer Davis, who had been the first to visit Dan, was there to speak with him. "I know you, Dan. I know you're not involved in anything illegal, but we have to follow up on these things. We've checked your barn already, and everything's in order, but you should be aware that someone is making a lot of noise about you. I'm not sure who it is, but it's making you look bad." Dan's anger flared. He wanted to shout, to tell the officer exactly who he suspected, but he knew it wouldn't help. It would just make him look like he was paranoid or desperate. By now, it was clear. Richard Johnson wasn't going to stop. The false reports, the harassment, it was all part of his strategy to force Dan to sell the farm. He had tried everything else, and now he was playing dirty. Dan had to figure out a way to stop it before it destroyed everything he had worked for. The tension between Dan and Richard Johnson reached a boiling point one evening, just days after the third false police report. Dan had been feeling the strain of the constant harassment, but he tried to stay focused on his work. He had to. The crops needed tending, and the farm couldn't run itself. But as dusk settled over the farm, something felt different. The air was thick with unease. Dan was finishing up his evening rounds when he noticed something out of place, a flicker of light near the far end of his barn. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the fading daylight, but then the light grew brighter, and he realized with a shock that it was fire. His heart leapt into his throat as the full reality hit him. His barn, his workspace, his family's legacy was on fire. Without a second thought, Dan sprinted toward the barn, shouting for his dogs to stay back. The flames were already licking the wooden structure, climbing up the walls with terrifying speed. The barn was old, built decades ago, and the dry wood and hay stored inside were like kindling. Dan's mind raced, but the only thing he could think of was getting inside to save the valuable equipment and any animals that might be trapped inside. By the time he reached the barn, the flames had already spread too far. The smoke was suffocating, and the heat was unbearable. Dan could hear the crackling of the fire as the wood splintered and broke. There was no chance of saving anything. His equipment, tools, and supplies were lost. He staggered back, gasping for air as he saw the fire truck lights in the distance. He knew there was nothing they could do now. The barn was beyond saving, and the damage was catastrophic. He could feel the weight of the loss settle on his chest, but at the same time, his anger boiled over. Someone had done this. Someone had intentionally set the fire. The firefighters worked tirelessly, but the barn was a total loss. As the flames were finally doused, Dan stood there, watching the smoldering remains of what had been his family's pride and joy for generations. It was then that he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Footprints leading away from the barn toward the tree line. They were fresh, unmistakably human, and they led directly to the back of Richard Johnson's property. Dan's suspicion turned to certainty. Richard Johnson was behind this. The fire, the harassment, the constant pressure, it was all part of his strategy to force Dan off the land. He wanted the property, and now he was resorting to violence to get it. Dan couldn't let this go any longer. He called the sheriff's office, but he knew it wouldn't be easy to prove anything. Johnson had likely covered his tracks well, but Dan had seen enough. The fire wasn't just an isolated act of aggression. It was the breaking point. Johnson had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. The next morning, Dan went to the sheriff's office to file a report. He showed them the footprints, and although the officers were hesitant to immediately accuse anyone, they agreed to investigate. Dan knew that they would need more evidence, but his resolve had never been stronger. He wasn't going to let Johnson intimidate him any longer. But the fire wasn't the only escalation. Over the following days, Dan noticed even more signs of aggression. His fences were repeatedly cut, and his animals were spooked, their feed mysteriously disappearing. The final straw came when Dan found a large "For Sale" sign planted on his front lawn one morning, with Richard Johnson's name and a bold statement offering millions for the property. It was the ultimate insult, an in-your-face declaration that Johnson would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Dan knew that it wasn't just a matter of refusing to sell anymore. This was a battle for his land, his legacy, and his family's future. And it seemed like Richard Johnson was willing to do whatever it took to win. Things had been quiet for a few days after the fire, but the uneasy calm was shattered one fateful afternoon when Dan received an unexpected knock on his door. He had just finished his lunch and was about to head out to check on the remaining animals when he saw two police cruisers parked near his gate. His stomach dropped. The last thing he needed was another police visit, especially after everything that had happened with Johnson. Officer Davis, the same sheriff who had investigated the previous false complaints, approached him with a solemn look on his face. "Dan," he greeted, his voice serious. "We need to talk. We've received another report, and this one's a bit more serious." Dan's heart raced. "What now?" he asked, already dreading the answer. He couldn't help but think this had something to do with Richard Johnson. The past few weeks had been full of harassment, and now it seemed like Johnson was pushing things even further. "It's about an alleged threat," Officer Davis explained. "A report came in stating that you've been making threats against Mr. Johnson, specifically that you said you'd harm him if he didn't stop pressuring you to sell the farm." Dan could hardly believe what he was hearing. Threats? He hadn't threatened anyone, let alone Johnson. He had kept to himself, focused on rebuilding what little he had left after the fire. But the more he thought about it, the more it all seemed too familiar. It was another lie, another fabrication in a series of attempts to paint him as the villain. "I've never made any threats like that," Dan said firmly, his voice steady despite the anger rising within him. "I've been trying to mind my own business and get my farm back on track. This is just another one of Richard's games." Officer Davis looked uncertain. "I know you, Dan, and I know this isn't like you, but we have to follow up on every report no matter how bizarre it sounds. Do you mind if I take a look around and see if there's any truth to this?" Dan, frustrated but knowing he had no choice, agreed. He walked the officer around his property, showing him his barn, the animals, and even the spot where the fire had been. There was nothing to suggest any hostility or threat. In fact, Dan was so tired of being dragged into these ridiculous accusations that he almost wanted to laugh. How could anyone take these lies seriously? "I don't know what's going on with Johnson," Dan muttered as they walked back toward the house, "but I'm not about to be dragged through this again." After a thorough inspection, Officer Davis had no choice but to admit that there was nothing to back up Johnson's claims. "I'll file this away as unfounded, Dan," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "But be careful. These false accusations are starting to add up, and someone's going to take notice eventually." Dan nodded, but the seed of suspicion had already been planted deep within him. He knew this wasn't the end. Johnson wasn't done. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the real goal wasn't just to buy him out, it was to ruin him. Later that day, Dan received another shock. Johnson had called the police once again, but this time it was for something much more serious. He was accusing Dan of assaulting him during an alleged confrontation that had never happened. Johnson claimed that Dan had shown up at his property, threatened him physically, and made derogatory remarks about his intentions to take over the land. The details of the accusation were absurdly fabricated, and the entire story reeked of desperation. Dan was furious. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a deliberate attempt to ruin his reputation and force him to leave. He knew Johnson was the mastermind behind it all, and the fact that he had stooped to such a low level only solidified Dan's resolve to stand his ground. As the police arrived to investigate yet another absurd accusation, Dan realized that this was the point of no return. Johnson had crossed every line. He wasn't just trying to buy Dan's farm anymore, he was trying to destroy him. And Dan was done playing along. The tension in the air felt suffocating as Dan watched the workers gather on the edge of his property. It had been a few days since the police dismissed Johnson's false accusations, but Dan knew it wouldn't be long before the next move came. He could feel it. Johnson wasn't the type to give up easily, especially now that he had resorted to such underhanded tactics. But what Dan wasn't prepared for was what happened next. One morning, as he was walking through the fields, checking the condition of the crops, he spotted a large construction vehicle parked on the edge of his land just outside his fence. At first, Dan thought it might be some kind of mistake. Maybe the city had authorized something in the area that he wasn't aware of, but as he got closer, his stomach sank. There were workers unloading materials, preparing to tear down part of his barn. A bulldozer sat idling nearby. Dan's heart raced. He recognized one of the men, a contractor who had worked on Johnson's house. Without thinking, he stormed up to the group, demanding answers. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dan shouted, trying to stay calm despite the anger bubbling inside him. The contractor looked up, visibly startled. We're here to start demolishing the barn. Mr. Johnson hired us, said he had all the proper permits to clear the land for future development." Dan's blood ran cold. "What permits?" "This is my land. I never gave anyone permission to tear down anything here. You need to pack up and leave." The contractor hesitated, clearly nervous, but the presence of the bulldozer made it clear that this wasn't just some misunderstanding. It was an orchestrated effort to take what wasn't theirs. Dan's thoughts raced. Johnson had somehow gotten these men on his property, without Dan's permission, to clear it for the development he wanted. This wasn't just an attempt to pressure him into selling. It was a full-fledged land grab. He immediately pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office, but before he could even explain the situation, one of the workers raised a hand and shouted, "We're just following orders, man. Mr. Johnson told us this place was his." The reality of the situation hit Dan hard. It was one thing to deal with constant harassment, but this was something else. They weren't just trying to buy the land. Johnson was trying to steal it. The fact that he had gone to such lengths, hiring a contractor to destroy property, forging documents, and even trespassing with hired hands, made Dan realize the depth of Johnson's desperation. Within minutes, the sheriff's deputies arrived, but even then, the confrontation wasn't over. The workers didn't want to back down, and Johnson wasn't about to let this fail without a fight. When Officer Davis arrived, Dan explained the situation, and the officer immediately called for a stop to the work. However, Johnson's lawyer was already on the phone, shouting that the demolition was part of a legal process. He claimed Johnson had filed an eminent domain request for the land, and the sheriff's office needed to honor the request. Dan couldn't believe it. Johnson was playing dirty with every legal loophole he could find, twisting rules to his advantage. "This is my property," Dan said firmly, standing between the workers and his barn. "You don't get to just come in here and take it from me. I haven't signed anything, and I don't care what permits he thinks he has. There's nothing legal about this." The sheriff's deputies, after reviewing the situation and calling in their legal counsel, confirmed what Dan already knew. There were no permits, and Johnson had no legal right to take the farm in this manner. The land wasn't part of any eminent domain agreement, and Dan's ownership was indisputable. The bulldozer was ordered to leave, and the workers packed up, albeit reluctantly. But this wasn't the end of the fight. As Dan stood there, watching the workers drive away, he knew that Johnson wouldn't stop here. The man was too driven, too greedy to just walk away. This attack on his land was just the beginning of something even uglier. Dan was facing not just a neighbor who wanted to expand, but a man who was willing to use every underhanded tactic to take what didn't belong to him. Dan's resolve hardened as he stared at the smoldering remnants of his barn. He had fought back once, but the next time Johnson came at him, it wouldn't just be about defending his property. It would be about defending his family's legacy. The day after the failed attempt to tear down his barn, Dan knew he couldn't wait any longer. Richard Johnson had gone too far. The false accusations, the fire, the demolition attempt, each action showed just how far Johnson was willing to push to get his hands on Dan's property. But Dan wasn't about to let Johnson get away with it. He had enough evidence to take action now. Dan immediately reached out to his lawyer, and they began gathering all the documentation they could find. They scoured the local property records, dug into Johnson's history, and started tracking down anyone who could provide testimony about his suspicious activities. But the most important thing was the footprints from the night of the fire. Those footprints led straight to Johnson's property, and Dan was determined to connect those dots. With his lawyer's help, Dan filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, requesting a full investigation into the arson. He also contacted local news outlets, knowing that exposing Johnson's actions would help turn the tide in his favor. It wasn't just about taking legal action anymore. It was about making sure the public knew who Richard Johnson really was. The sheriff's department took Dan's report seriously, and soon enough, the investigation was underway. The forged permits Johnson had used to hire contractors to demolish Dan's barn were uncovered, and witnesses who had been involved in the construction process came forward, testifying that they had been instructed to falsify documents and ignore property lines. It all began to unravel, but the real breakthrough came when Dan's lawyer uncovered emails between Johnson and a local zoning official, emails that showed Johnson had bribed the official to speed up the process of annexing Dan's land for his development project. The case against Johnson was building, and it was stronger than ever. He wasn't just guilty of harassment, he was guilty of fraud, bribery, and attempted land theft. The news broke quickly. Local reporters swarmed Dan's farm, eager to get the story. As the truth about Johnson's actions came to light, it was impossible for him to spin the narrative anymore. Dan had kept a detailed record of every incident, every false report, every confrontation, and with the help of witnesses, police reports, and the damning evidence of bribery and forgery, Johnson's empire of lies began to collapse. The sheriff's office, having gathered enough evidence, arrested Richard Johnson. He was charged with multiple counts, including fraud, conspiracy, arson, and attempted theft. The case quickly escalated to a court hearing, where Johnson's former associates and contractors testified against him, all confirming that he had used every tactic available to force Dan out. The trial lasted for several weeks, with Johnson's lawyers trying their best to discredit the evidence and paint Dan as a liar. But Dan stood firm, recounting every moment of the harassment, showing the court the footprints from the fire and the forged documents. The witnesses were credible, the facts were undeniable, and the public outcry against Johnson grew louder by the day. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, it was a resounding win for Dan. Johnson was convicted on all charges, and the judge handed down a sentence that shocked even the defense team. Johnson was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his crimes, and the court ordered him to pay substantial damages to Dan, covering not only the financial losses from the fire and the damages to his property, but also for the emotional distress Johnson had caused. Dan couldn't believe it. Justice had been served, and it had been a hard-fought battle. He had stood his ground when most people would have folded. The victory wasn't just about the money, it was about something far more important. He had protected his home, his family, and the land his ancestors had worked for generations. As the courtroom emptied and the media frenzy died down, Dan stood outside the courthouse, his heart still racing. The weight of the last few months had finally lifted. He had won. And for the first time in a long while, he could breathe easy, knowing that the land he loved would never be taken from him. Months had passed since the trial, but the echoes of Richard Johnson's defeat still lingered in the small town. The news of his conviction had spread quickly, and for the first time in a long while, Dan felt a sense of peace wash over him. The battle had been long, exhausting, and at times overwhelming, but in the end, justice had prevailed. Dan spent the next few weeks making repairs to his farm, rebuilding what had been lost in the fire, and restoring his land to its former state. The insurance money from the settlement helped, but more than anything, it was the satisfaction of knowing that his family's legacy was safe. The feeling of finally having his hands clean of Johnson's schemes was a relief that Dan had never expected to feel. One morning, as he stood outside inspecting the new fence that had been erected around the barn, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another call about farm business, but instead, it was a message from his lawyer. Johnson has been sentenced. 10 years, plus restitution. Dan's heart skipped a beat. 10 years. He had heard that the trial would lead to significant consequences for Johnson, but seeing it in writing made it all feel real. He had done it. He had stood up to a man who would stop at nothing to take what wasn't his, and in doing so, he had protected everything he held dear. The next few days were filled with the normal activities of farm life, but the cloud that had hung over him for so long had finally dissipated. Richard Johnson was in prison, and Dan was free to continue his life on his terms. As the news continued to spread about Johnson's arrest and conviction, Dan found himself receiving congratulations from neighbors and even strangers who had heard about the case. He'd become a bit of a local hero, the man who had stood up to the bully and won. One evening, as Dan sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The land was his, the farm was his family's history and his own future were intact. The struggles of the past months seemed to fade away, replaced by the warmth of the golden light stretching across the fields. Then, as if on cue, his son walked out of the house, holding a beer in his hand. "You did it, Dad," he said, sitting down beside him. "It's over. We're free." Dan smiled, his eyes tired but content. "Yeah, it's over, and it's a new day." They clinked their bottles together, watching the fields stretch out before them. The battle was over, and Dan Miller had emerged victorious.